In my extended family, there are 5 women of childbearing age, all within several years of each other. 4 of the 5 women have chosen to make children, to grow, literally, a family. Of those 4 women, there were 8 pregnancies. 5 pregnancies were successful and produced healthy infants. 3 pregnancies ended in miscarriage. 4 women, 8 pregnancies, 3 miscarriages. Let's talk about blood today at church, shall we? This is normative, right? I mean, we always talk about Jesus's blood, the blood of Christ, the blood that poured out of the 2 hands, 2 feet, and something like the colon or the appendix. Heck, we even sing about Jesus's blood. That's weird, right? Even worse, we drink it like freaking vampires. In fact, we've normalized this so much that we call it sacred and actually look forward to it on Sundays. Our first Sunday back at church post pandemic, my mom walked down the aisle sobbing, overcome with emotion, as she went to drink God's blood. That's weird. You understand this, right? Or is it weird that we don't talk about women's blood? In the old part of the Old Testament, when women would menstruate, they were sent to the red tent where they could rest and have cold compresses on their head and warm ones on their abdomen. They had good meals prepared for them, and they were initiated into the women's club of shared stories and lives. An exhausting nuisance back then was a rite of passage and a resting time for women who worked the fields and cooked the meals and took care of children and took care of their husbands day in and day out. Then the Levitical code got written down. Thanks a lot, Moses, for getting that ball rolling. And suddenly, women became unfit when menstruating, and there were all sorts of rules about where people could sit. Oh my God, don't sit in a pew after a menstruating woman has sat there. That's illegal. And there were rules about sex and menstruating. Don't do it. And sheesh, the priests made quite the to-do about the do's and don'ts of it all. By the time of the Pharisees, Judaism really had it out for women in their blood. Unlike their Greco-Roman counterparts who practically worshipped menstruating women, Jewish women with any level of dysfunction in their menstrual cycle, pregnancies, or reproductive organs were permanently unclean, as we learn from this story, were ostracized from their community, just like the people with leprosy. You get out of our town so we can stay clean. If you have an abnormal pap smear, or if you bleed mid-pregnancy, or if you have endometriosis or uterine fibroids, or your cheating husband gave you chlamydia, or if your uterus has a tear and 12 years later, the doctors still can't stop the hemorrhaging, like the woman in this story, you are unclean. If the tear or miscarriage only happens once, you might get away with politely saying unclean when someone bumps into you while grocery shopping at the market, or if your kid drops his book bag outside temple and somebody bends down to help you pick up all the books. Those polite calls of unclean with an eye roll or an apologetic smile might get you a pass. But if the community finds out that what you have doesn't heal, or the bleeding continues and a ritual washing isn't working, watch out. Maybe a priest will come to your house and give you the bad news. Maybe a mob forms like in all the good horror films. I don't know. What I do know is the woman with the blood and the lepers with the blisters are gone. Ostracized, because everyone knew they were wounded, sick, poor from having spent all their money on doctors, but most of all, unclean. Fast forward 2,000 years, and thank God we're in a much better place. No one knows when a woman's on her period or if she even has a period. And we have all these helpful and polite things like tampons and pads and condoms and IUDs to keep people from knowing about our private lives and our private parts. And isn't that so much better to not know who is wounded, sick, or feeling unclean? It really makes life much easier. It's so much prettier without the blood. On some level, it's a metaphor, right? Kind of like Jesus's blood. You aren't really drinking blood. You can't fool me with that grape juice. And the wound that woman couldn't heal from wasn't just a hemorrhaging uterus, was it? In the verses right before this story, the wealthy, status secure synagogue leader Jairus begs Jesus to heal his daughter. So Jesus, Jairus, and the disciples and an excited crowd are on their way to Jairus's home when the hemorrhaging woman manages to touch Jesus. In fact, this woman's story interrupts Jairus' story in the 5th chapter of Mark. And so a distraught servant arrives at the scene and calls out, "Jairus, your daughter is dead," in dismay because their arrival had been delayed by this woman and her blood. "Jairus, your daughter is dead. Do not disturb the teacher anymore." "Teacher," the synagogue leader's servant called him. "Teacher," the disciples called him. "Teacher," the people call him. And immediately after this story, Jesus goes to his own hometown to teach in the synagogue. What really drug out this rescue mission of Jairus' daughter? Was it the woman who touched Jesus? Or was it that Jesus stopped when he realized it? And not just stopped, but made the whole crowd stop too as he demanded to know, "Who touched me?" And in front of all the disciples and Jairus and everyone pushing and elbowing their way through the narrow streets that day, Jesus takes up his role of teacher again. He stops everyone and asks, "Who touched me?" The disciples, dense as ever, state the obvious. "There's 100 people in this alley. How do we know who pushed you?" "Not pushed, touched," Jesus said. And the woman knew that Jesus knew she was unclean. And he knew, just like she did, that she had been healed by his touch. So she told the truth. She who had been hiding, forced to the outskirts of town alone for 12 years, outed herself and told her story. And in a teachable moment in the crowded street that day, Jesus said, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." I'd stipulate that in a short gospel where the writer uses the word teacher 17 times to describe Jesus, one point of this story is not just that Jesus can perform miracles of healing. In front of all those people, he calls the woman daughter and returns to her her dignity and a place in society. Jesus calls her faithful, in stark juxtaposition to the disciples and Jairus' family in the next story, who laugh when Jesus says the daughter isn't dead, she's sleeping. Jesus tells her to go in peace, publicly restoring her place in society, dismantling the system that forced her to the literal outside of town. And finally, he reiterates that she is healed from her hemorrhaging. Ironic that the one no one would touch was healed with a touch and a teaching. Jesus teaches the community how to respond to people who are wounded. We could probably stand to learn from that ourselves today. How do you respond to people with unhealed wounds? I've been fascinated by a new term I heard recently called invisible disability. Diversification has been important to me for a long time now, but while attending equity, diversity, and inclusion classes during the pandemic, I learned the term invisible disabilities, and it slayed me. Invisible disabilities are disabilities that aren't made obvious by wheelchairs or a seeing eye dog or cochlear implants or a flat face with almond shaped eyes or by hands that flail when a person gets excited. Invisible disabilities often can be hidden woundedness, things like multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, depression, cystic fibrosis, PTSD. These are wounds that are not obvious at first glance. I wrote to a friend of mine during the pandemic who has MS. I knew it had flared and she was having a difficult time. Likewise, I was battling my own woundedness. I wrote to her, I just discovered the phrase invisible disability, which has brought me much comfort, even if it isn't something I would share publicly. Except here I am in a church sharing it publicly. I continued. Wrestling with self-actualization in your 40s is something. I thought I was going to kick the world's ass in my 40s, a la Kate Blanchett or Tilda Swinton. Instead, I feel like a little yellow minion running around bumping into things, or maybe Jessica Simpson during the buzz cut years, except not rich, famous, or a semi-funny cartoon character who gets to act opposite Steve Carell. I feel like I'm looking into a mirror, she wrote back. My point is, so many people, so many of us suffer from unhealed wounds that never seem to stop bleeding, metaphorically or physically. And maybe not all of us have the faith of that woman to publicly out ourselves and our woundedness. Special thanks to our LGBTQIA community who lead the way in helping people tell their stories openly and honestly. Wounded people are watching and learning from your outings, your truths. I promise. The story of Jairus' daughter and the story of the woman Jesus calls daughter are so wonderful in so many ways. I could preach 100 sermons on these two stories. Don't worry, I won't. I've been commissioned for this week only. And for this week, this beautiful text leaves me with this question. Having met the teacher yourselves, having heard this story, and striving daily, or maybe at least quarterly, to follow Christ's example, how will you return dignity to those afraid they have lost it? How will you tear down systems that marginalize and oppress people in our communities? And since there's no garment for wounded people to reach out and touch today, how will you help people find literal healing? Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. May we all be so lucky and so faithful. Amen.